start recording. And then for those who could not make it, and it seems like a lion's share of people, and I was a little bit remiss, and I should have had an announcement up last night to remind people that we were going to meet synchronously today. But, having said that, it's kind of on people. It's like if people had been in attendance on Tuesday, that wouldn't have been an issue. They wouldn't have known. They would know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this session. I'm going to put it up on the blog. For those of you who are here, you're not going to have to worry about it. For those who are not here, you're simply going to have to view it like any other lecture on the blog. All right. So that means nothing to anybody that's here right now, right? So the reasons, okay, so the decision-making process to get together today, what was it based upon? Well, I think primarily it was based upon the fact that, different things. One, I think that we are in a place right now where we should be communicating in real time about the things that are going on the electoral front that affect us all. And in my wisdom, I felt that people were having difficult times to deal with this, and I kind of knew, and I kind of saw it coming down Broadway, what was going to happen, So, it behooved us to at least get together. I think that both in this class and Intro to Mass Media, when something like this is, when we're in the midst of something like this, in a course which speaks directly to the ways in which consensus and subjectivity is shaped by visual culture and the mass media, it really, I would be remiss if we weren't talking about it. And we weren't talking about it specifically in the mode of the ways in which it is being served up to us. The ways in which, the mass, the coverage of it in terms of its veracity, in terms of its commitment to the public good, in terms of its journalistic integrity. I think all these things, once again, I hate to bring up the Matrix, but once again, I think that we find a prime example in this media environment that we are thrust into right now. I think we're seeing a prime example of living in an environment that is not necessarily trustable, in terms of the information it's providing. Is some of it doing exactly what it needs to do? I would say, yeah. I would say that some of it, I think that the major networks are, doing are doing competent, given everything that we know, giving everything that we know about media consolidation, media conglomeration, the way in which, the corporate state has its fingers into everything. I think that you're doing an adequate job, but let's talk about the ways in which it is biased. All right. Let's get a consensus for those of you who want to share. How invested are you in watching this? Because some of you might not have any investment at all in watching these proceedings. Although it's like I had been saying on Tuesday, I don't think it took a Nostradamus or some Swami with the gift of second sight to predict where this was going to go, given the logistical dynamics of it. And I don't think it takes like a Nostradamus to predict what the possible backlash, what the possible sociological, political scenarios, what will be presented to us in the days to follow. And so we should talk a little bit about that Okay, first of all, let me hear your input about the ways in which you are taking this thing up and your feelings and your thoughts and feelings about this. You know, like
Um,
what sources are you going to get information, and are you processing that information, and how would you rate that information?
I guess I am kind of look just Googling um winning, and then I
Greg, I'm sorry, you're
to
breaking up a little.
if
You're breaking up a lot. Are other people having problems hearing
um
him?
He's breaking up for me
Yeah,
too.
he's out a lot.
Greg, Greg, you're breaking up a lot. Can you bounce out and bounce back in and see how it goes?
yeah
All right, just bounce back in and see what your mic is like when you come back in. But while we're waiting for him, how about some of the other more articulate people in this class? Nathaniel, what's your take on all this? I know you've got to have a take.
I'm kind of keeping my eye on it. There was something interesting we noticed. Mom and I noticed because she was watching it. When they were assigning like the electoral stuff, conservative news networks were giving Biden like a bigger lead than like the more liberal ones. They were being a bit more the liberal ones being a bit more conservative in their assigning electoral votes.
You're saying that, like, are you telling me, like, to take an example, like Fox News was like emphasizing the Biden gap, the Biden's ascendancy in this? Because
Pretty
that seems
much.
like counterintuitive.
A bit. Like yesterday, they had him at like 264, like Fox News and like the Associated Press, and then like I think like CNN and ABC were still reporting at 253.
Wait, run that stat by me again.
Like Fox News and the Associated Press both had a 264 yesterday, which is what he's at today. But at that same time, CNN and like ABC were reporting him at 253.
What could we like? What would like? How? What would we attribute to that gap? Because I'm very interested. Because it would seem counterintuitive. It would seem that like the conservative networks would kind of falling in the camp of prematurely celebrating like Trump's thing. But then again, it becomes a question of just like the stats are the stats, depending on like what your data gathering process is. That might not have a bias, you know. But we have to understand that there is bias on every single level of this. There's psychological bias in terms of the fact that, for instance, it's like if you watch if you were watching CBS, it's like no television journalist goes into this scenario without having some bias due to whether they support Trump or Biden, and you could hear it. You could hear it in the ways in which things were used. You could hear it in the inflect, like the overall, like that. I mean, let me give you an example. It's like I used to watch. It's like I used to watch the Giants playing on like, and not like on Giants radio, but on CBS or something like that. When John Madden was doing the commentating, there was always this kind of the ways that he would talk about things always kind of was beholden to the Giants due to the fact that he was just a Giants fan, you know. And even though he was like he was supposed to be objective. He would let he would fact that he was partial to the Giants kind of slip through, and that kind of slipping through is like totally like a natural thing, you know. Um, but there's the bias on that level, but there's also the bias that we know due to media conglomeration and consolidation and what the owner's bias would be. For instance, the New York Post, was obviously biased to Trump, primarily due to the fact that they're owned by the arch conservative Rupert Murdoch. I want to see if I can't grab the headline here. I'm probably not going to be able to find it, but on Monday, the front page was, and I'm paraphrasing here, but they were, they said something to the Trump was last minute marches to a victory run. I wanted to see if I can't find exactly what they said on 11. They're not getting cover. Nah, they're not giving it to me. I can't remember exactly what they said. But they've been pro-Trump. They endorsed Trump. So listen, before we do any of this, I want to get some bullet points going on here so we know where we're at before we continue this conversation. Cancel that. Share. So for this week, you should be finishing up the Susan Sontag essay, which I'm going to round out today, hopefully. The Andre Bazin essay on the ontology of the photographic image, and then the Peter Benson essay. Both of those are very short on the ontology of the photograph from analog to digital. I also wanted to draw attention really quick to the book that is on deck that I will be sent. E. Debord's book, The Society of the Spectacle, that we will start immediately after we get done. We'll probably start it next week. And the Society of the Spectacle was written in 1968, all right, by a French theorist and also a kind of he was affiliated with the Marxist groups, but he was more prominently affiliated with this political group called the Situationists, all right, which were very, very interesting, and they were very instrumental in a lot of the student-led riots and student-led protests in Paris and the Sorbonne at the time of the French and American investment in the Vietnam War. The Society, and I think that when we start reading Society of the Spectacle, you're going to realize that some of his observations in 1968 about what was going on then, about this within the society, were absolutely prescient and applicable to what is going on now in ways that one could almost make the case that some of the things he said in 68 might even be more. It's kind of like the Matrix, right? We talked about the Matrix as a text and how it might be even more pertinent to our situation now than it was when it came out. I feel the same way about Society of the Spectacle. It's a short book. We're not going to read, right? We're going to read the first few chapters because he has a tendency. The foundations of his overall theory get laid out like in the first three chapters, and I have to also, run a disclaimer that he's a little bit of a hard read, all right? But he writes in these things called aphorisms, all right? Meaning that he doesn't really write in these long, drawn-out chapters. There's chapters, but he writes in like paragraphs, like aphorism one. You'll have to like, in order for me to explain it to you, you'll have to get into it. But no reason to buy that book unless you want to, because there's like, once again, like ways of seeing. That book is so popular that there's like 8 different free versions of that. Well, I think that once we start to get into that book, we're going to want to read it in lieu of. I think it has a lot to say about the election. I think it has a lot to say about the pandemic, and I'll explain the reasons why when we get into it. All right, so let's figure that I'm not going to outright assign it right now, but over the weekend or Friday, I'm going to send out a link to it so we can start. You might as well, for all intents and purposes, I would say that let me get something out tomorrow, and we should at least be on. We should at least be getting into chapter 1 by next week, either in the video lecture or in the discussion. All right. The other thing I really quickly wanted to bring to people's attention was the email that I got. For those of you who kind of want to stay on the ball in regards to the spring, the email that I got, where am I? I don't know. I just never know. I don't need to know this guy. I see no room for Blackboard. This is an ongoing thing that's going on with people. People are not seeing the room for Blackboard. I don't know what that's about. Just really quick though. Advising is going on. Starting tomorrow, I believe, for the department. Communication advising days. I got this. Okay, so there's virtual communications advising days. They start tomorrow from 9 a.m. to 12 and from 1 to 3. I would strongly advise getting on either tomorrow or the 13th, which is also 9 to 12 and 1 to 3. Dave Mahalik will be there from the advising center, as well as Tim. If you want to make an appointment for a daytime for these days, you have to make an appointment with Lori Rackett. You can contact her at racketla@sunybroom.edu. I assume you guys got this information, all right? But make sure to make an appointment so that you're not like left in the cold with courses, all right? And also, and I'll just say, and you guys know me. I don't do a lot of like self-promotion, shameless self-promotion, but courses that I'm teaching next semester are as follows. I'm teaching image theory, which I don't need to plug in this class because you're in it. And but I'm also doing a class, Com 240, called Mass Media Research Methods, and that meets from what time does that meet? Nathaniel, what time did that meet last semester? Do you remember? Mass Media 240.
I don't remember.
It started at 3 o'clock, didn't it? It started at yeah, it's Tuesday, Thursdays from 3 to 4:15. So that class could use some support in terms of numbers. But it's like, if that class went pretty well, Nathaniel, would you say? I mean, be brutally honest about it. How was that class? It was good?
Yeah.
That's all. That's all right. But last semester we had a discussion with the author of our textbook. Arthur Berger, which was cool, from San Francisco, and we covered a lot of ground in there. And I want to like kind of rethink that class this semester in terms of like doing like actual like investigative pieces, you know. So it's going to be a little different, but you know, if you're going to take it, it's like go in and tell Tim you want to take it with me. You want to take it with me, because the other guy is going to. I'm not going to say. I'm not going to say that. Let me get a hold. Okay, really quickly. All right, so let's go to the. I know I'm all over the place here today, but there's a lot going on, and one of the places that I generally go for really interesting and up to date information is Amy Goodman at Democracy Now, you know, which is an independent news source. That I feel that, you know, in the sea of the matrix, it tends to have some indexical bearing on reality in terms of, you know, the fact that, you know, it's not beholden to, you know, corporate masters on a far mountaintop. But this is the report from this morning.
There's no sound. I can't hear it.
No sound at all. Hold on. You know, I blackboard, you guys. Just you don't know how much I love it. Hold on. Hold on. Let me go back. It says application. Share audio. Okay, now you should be able to hear it, hopefully.
Undecided race.
Yeah.
Quarantine report. I'm Amy Goodman. The presidential race remains too close to call. A Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden, is closing in on securing enough electoral votes to win after news outlets projected him winning two key states in the Midwest, Wisconsin and Michigan. According to the Associated Press, Biden has now secured 264 electoral votes. He will reach the needed 270 if he wins any of the four undecided races. Nevada, where he has a slim lead of less than 8,000 votes. Georgia, where Trump is winning by 18,000 votes, but many tens of thousands of votes have yet to be counted. North Carolina, where Trump is leading by 77,000 votes. Or Pennsylvania, where Trump is up by 165,000. Many absentee ballots have still not been counted. Biden briefly spoke on Wednesday.
I'm not here to declare that we've won, but I am here to report when the count is finished, we believe we will be the winners.
President Trump made multiple false claims on Wednesday, suggesting Democrats are stealing the election. At one point, Trump wrote on Twitter he was claiming for electoral vote purposes the states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and Michigan, even as votes are still being counted. The Trump campaign also filed lawsuits in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia, and has requested a recount in Wisconsin. On Wednesday, Wisconsin's chief elections official, Megan Wolf, said Trump's claims of electoral fraud are an insult to election workers.
Anybody's welcome to watch that process. Some of the places even live streamed their tally last night. And so I think that it's insulting to our local election officials to say that yesterday's election was anything but an incredible success.
On Wednesday,
so, you know, herein we have the commander in chief, the executor of the Oval Office, the head of the executive branch. Basically, I mean, in the psychological milieu of the diagnostic and statistics manual for psychological conditions, it's like a person. Let's take for an example a person who goes and buys a lottery ticket and checks the numbers, and for whatever strange reason is convinced that they have won the lottery, walks into a place to cash it in, and said cashier takes a look at said lottery ticket and says, sir, these numbers in no way match the winning numbers. All right? People that we usually call that, it's a very technical term, it's called delusional. It's called a delusion, which in layman's terms means pretty much a total disconnect with like reality. All right. And the ways in which, but at the same time, we have to understand the power of belief and the power of an overarching message to a demographic that is already fairly convinced, that has a demographic that has convinced itself that the deep state has somehow got their tentacles into the electoral process to derail said candidate. And the beliefs and that kind of contagion of the belief system that they operate under. All right. And I think it's not too difficult to like speculate about I think that I would be remiss if I did not put it out there my strong suspicions and fears about the kind of backlash that is going to go on in the wake of this. All right. And we're kind of and getting back to democracy now. We're starting to see signs of this right now.
The audio is down again.
All right. We're losing it here. It's just too many buttons. It's too much. Hold on. Let's take it back.
Trump supporters stormed a vote counting center in Detroit, Michigan.
It's good.
Windows and doors behind which election officials were busy counting mail-in ballots. Detroit is a largely African-American city. Meanwhile, another group of Trump protesters gathered in Arizona chanting, "Count the vote." Many of the protesters were openly carrying AR-15 assault rifles and other guns. A local TV news crew said they left the site after a Trump supporter threatened them and said he would find out where they live. While Fox and the Associated Press have called Arizona for Biden, the Trump campaign is hoping to win the state once all votes are counted. Pro-democracy protesters took to the streets in cities across the United States Wednesday, condemning Trump's efforts to steal the election. In Minneapolis, police arrested hundreds of marchers Wednesday night as they flooded Interstate 94. Here in New York, police kettled about 60 marchers at a Manhattan protest and arrested them. Earlier Wednesday, activist Linda Sarsour spoke at a protest outside the New York Public Library.
Today, we demand that every vote is counted. Tomorrow, we organize and we fight regardless of who goes to the White House.
In Maine, Republican Susan Collins has been elected
That's very interesting. Yeah. She wants to fight regardless of who goes to the White House. I don't really know what that's about. But, let's talk about this in terms of possible scenarios. Let's open the floor up. What do you think things are going to look like in a few days? What are the possible scenarios that aren't necessarily they're not necessarily the definite scenarios, but there seems to be a kind of zeitgeist, a kind of spirit of tension going on here that could prove to be someone could contagious. You know, especially when protesters in Arizona, you know, half of them are in possession of AR-15s, which is a really good weapon, by the way. Let's talk about this. What are people's fears? I mean, there's the obvious fear of just, you know, especially some of you that live in like, you know, major metropolitan areas that, you know, this might, you know, kind of this might, you know, light up in a way that could foresee the protests in Portland and other places around George Floyd. You know, and I think that people need to be prepared for that. I think people need to be prepared for the far left, the far right backlash, and you know, you're already talking about. I mean, let's like the psychosocial milieu. It was pretty much like, you know, kind of like the powder keg that the fuse of George Floyd lit back back over the summer. You know, once again, you know, it's like, you know, you have a lot of people cooped in. You have a lot of it's like now we're seeing. I think that what we're seeing is a phenomena of election deniers. It kind of maps to the Venn diagram of like pandemic deniers in terms of, you know, how an entire half of a population would predicate their judgment on speculation, unwavering fealty and allegiance to somebody above and beyond like all logic and reason. You know, that's the kind of like, you know, we've already taught, it's like, you know, and if we haven't talked about it in this class, yeah, we will certainly be talking about it when we get to Society of Spectacle. You know, well, I think that we've already talked about, I think the Matrix very, very astutely paints an allegory of the people that are hypnotized by the mechanisms of control, you know, and how they will act to protect that system at all costs, you know. And I think we need to be wary of what at all cost will look like in the next week or so. You know, I mean, my gut feelings about it seem to lean towards an initial like flashpoint, like things like just out of control for a couple of days. But one thing I know about Americans, as opposed to like French or other places, we have a tendency to kind of wear out after a while. You know, it's gonna start getting cold. You know, it's like we don't have a lot of wherewithal when it comes to like this. It's like, you know, my hopes are that, you know, I mean, John Cleveland in the other class brought up a very important point, and it had to do with, you know, the idea that, you know, it's like it will rest on, it's like depending on his statesman-like qualities and his understanding of what he's going to need to do right out of the gate in terms of bringing those people on board. It's going to be very deft, and it's definitely going to have to, and it's definitely going to warrant some serious analysis of how he plays this out. You know, because certainly his style is going to be, you know, because I think a lot is going to ride on the optics of his message and the gestures he made and the conciliatory gestures he makes towards those people, you know, that will be very, very different from a Trump style, better or worse, I don't know. But we'll get deeper into it as we get deeper into other things. So, is there anything else we want to share about this? How people are feeling about this? This is like I was telling Intro to Mass Media this morning. To be somewhat edgy and somewhat anxious and somewhat not knowing what the future will hold is the correct response to such a situation. However, and I want to bring this back to I really want to quickly bring this back to somebody not too long ago in the class was asking me about different different tips and tricks to kind of navigate this thing in terms of getting through it. And one of the things that I stressed to the other class this morning, and it's something that I use in my own life, when things turn into when the seas are rocky, and I'm on a shit storm, is I think that a very, very good practice is to keep a regimen. Keep a regimen of things that you do, or things that are already in your regimen that you shouldn't break from, whether it be, exercising. If you work out every day, there's no reason to stop. And if you're not, maybe it's something you might want to pick up, taking some walks, and this ties back into the mini assignment of getting back into the real and just getting away from it for a while, in order to just decompress, and to also, but I think there are things that we need to do within ourselves. So frame this thing in a way in which, it's like I was joking around before I started recording, this idea that you need to be able to kind of, and I stay away from all the kind of feel good, fully silly hallmark, you need to stay positive, kind of bullshit. And I'm far more interested in being kind of a realist about things, and recognizing the fact that, in some of my darker, I can remember, being in a position in my own life at a time where it's things were really freaking dark, for me on a personal level, and somebody saying to me, the sun will come out again tomorrow. It always kind of flips. The sun will come out, one way or another. But we have to understand what we're up against, because it's like I had been saying during the lectures with the Matrix. How do we mobilize? How do we take control back over our own lives individually and collectively? First comes the knowledge. First comes the education and the knowledge of understanding what has happened, and then comes the action. Once we start to know the true status, our true concrete real status, despite everything that's being said to us, despite all of the propaganda, despite all of the, depending on what side of the fence you stand on, the misreporting of the pandemic numbers, as opposed to the fact that it seems like there's this global rise in the numbers, and that we're seeing numbers right now that are breaking records. This is something that is very real. All right, this is something that is very real. However, right now, running parallel to that reality is this dance that we're doing, this euphoric concentration and distraction on the results of this election. It's kind of like, and this is what the media has decided to foreground this week. All the other things seems to be growing with increased virulence. All right, it's almost kind of like when you go to a party and you go to a party, and for like 4 or 5 hours, it's like, whatever you do, whatever substances you, it's like everything kind of goes away for a while. Everything, all of those workaday problems and issues tend to, for a brief period of time, like we just don't care, right? Then in the morning we wake up and we realize that, it's like we have to face like the often grim, or just mundane realities that, we kind of took a break from. And I think that this election euphoria is very, very, I think that metaphor is very applicable to this kind of election euphoria that is going on right now. That will kind of foreground this for a while. Next week, the media will foreground all the conflicts, all the legal battles, that the Trump administration will attempt, and all the flash fires going around, and all this internecine strife that is going on in the major urban centers. However, while these distractions perpetuate themselves, this economy continues to rapidly descend beyond repair, and these pandemic numbers are rising in ways that any reasonable human being should be very, very alarmed about, and that something needs to be done, during this lame duck period that Biden is going to be like, kind of caught in. There's got to be some definite actions that are taken. There's no doubt. Thoughts, feelings, thoughts about this? Okay, so let's shift gears here and get into some try to finish out with Sontag and try to get into Bazan here, sharing files, blah blah blah. All right, so no other bullet points for now. Just look for my and I should have I'm going to be correcting papers today and probably tomorrow. Should have those 2-page essays by tomorrow or the weekend. Let's finish up what we were doing here with Sontag, because I think there were some important things we needed to talk about still. We talked about this whole idea of photography essentially being this kind of act of non-intervention, right? It's like when we're taking photographs, when we're in the status of taking photographs of something, it is the exact opposite of acting upon an object, all right? That we kind of, sequester ourselves off from the action itself, and opt to take the picture, right? And she talks about this dichotomy between acting and recording, and the ethical issues that it oftentimes brings up. Certainly for people covering, photojournalists and news journalists that are covering, events that include mass suffering or war or whatever. But oftentimes we kind of find ourselves in this paradox when in our own mundane lives. It's like people that have this tendency to opt for the picture of something as opposed to the experience of the thing. And we already talked about, like, that decision of being in the moment and experiencing something fully as opposed to taking a picture of it. And how, and Sontag would say that in a lot of ways, it is it's a kind of defense mechanism that we use. All right. I want to get into the really quickly here. Photographs, she says, photographs can abet desire in the most direct utilitarian ways. All right. She's talking, once again, we're in this whole thing about photographs, and this ties in directly with Berger, right? Photographs as a kind of um, enhancement of desire, a way of like kind of generating desire in the spectator, and the paradoxes involved with that kind of desire, right? She says photographs can abet desire in the most direct utilitarian way, as when someone calls the photographs of anonymous examples of the desirable as an aid to masturbation. The matter is more complex when photographs are used to stimulate the moral impulse. Desire has no history. At least it is experienced in each instance as all foreground, immediacy. It is aroused by archetypes and is, in that sense, abstract. All right. But moral feelings, okay, so she's trying to say something about images that arouse desire and how those images tend to be, and I think Berger talks about this too, right? That we're not concerned, we're looking at something, when we're looking at material, all right, this is just calling it what it is. We're all adults here, right? Person decides to look at a pornographic magazine or to watch a pornographic film, or they're not their main, their raison d'etre, their operandi at that point has nothing to do with the specific qualities of the people that are being portrayed. They are just these generic examples of these desirable bodies engaged in these poses. All right. So this is it's and it's the it's the exception to make them like real people. All right. Do we get that? There's a kind of abstraction of the people when it comes to um, images of desire, or images that are meant to generate desire in the subject. All right. But she says that, on the other hand, she says moral feelings are embedded in history. When a photograph is taken to move us in a moral and ethical way, as opposed to just making us aroused, that those feelings are embedded in history, whose personae are concrete, whose situations are always specific. Thus, almost opposite rules hold true for the use of the photograph to awaken desire and to awaken conscience. The images that mobilize conscience are always linked to a given historical situation. The more general they are, the less likely they are to be effective. All right. Um, so having said that, are there arguments against that? Because as I said the first time, I really thought about the ways in which there are exceptions in each, you know, for instance, like, let's say, like, back in the day, I'm just going to use an example, right? As far as like specificity is concerned, back when I was up as a kid, all right, in high school, there were a handful of supermodels that everybody was kind of into, like guys, all right? Like Farrah, there was this famous, iconic poster of Farrah Fawcett, like on a laying on a in a bathing, laying on a towel, and more people, like, I mean, that was like like the best selling poster of that year. But there were other ones too. There was like some of the names, Cheryl Teagues. There was like 5 or 6 it girls that year. that were like the sex icons of that year, so that one could ultimately make a case that the object of desire in that instance is not about it's I'm not just putting any girl on the wall. I'm putting Farrah Fawcett on my wall. I'm putting Cheryl Tiegs on my wall. So that there's a specificity in desire that isn't always generic, right? It's like coming up in the high school. It's like I have a crush on somebody in my class. It's this person. It's not Joe sitting next to him. It's this. So there's, so we like contend that maybe there is a specificity. On the other hand, I think that there are multiple instances on the other side of the divide about how pictures of a more general nature don't necessarily. I don't necessarily agree with her that I get what she's trying to say, and she'll explain it a little more specifically in the next couple chapters. But for instance, taking a look at the starving, the generic starving, we may or may not know what country these people come from. All right, we might not know the situation, but I think there's something about the content, the aesthetic content in this that does move us to this kind of generic, compassionate and empathetic, that we understand this kind of suffering, whether it happens in Syria or sub-Saharan Africa, that we are moved to a certain degree by the very nature of the picture, so that's a point of contention, A photograph, she says, that brings news of some unsuspected zone of misery cannot make a dent in public opinion unless there is an appropriate context of feeling and attitude. What is she saying here? All right, she goes on. The photographs Matthew Brady and his colleagues took of the horrors of the battlefields did not make people any less keen. Let's go to those pictures. The photographs Matthew Brady and his colleagues took of the horrors of the battlefields did not make people any less keen to go on with the Civil War. The photographs of ill-clad skeletal prisoners held in Andersonville inflamed Northern public opinion against the South, she says. That happened. The effect of the Andersonville photographs must have been partly due to the very novelty of that photographs at all. Remember, these are some of the first photographs. We're still in 1864, 1865. So the very novelty of these photographs might have led people to be somewhat shocked and moved. The political understanding, however, she says, that many Americans came to in the 1960s would allow them to look at photographs that Dorothea Lange took of people on the west coast of Africa being rather not the west coast of Africa, the Japanese Americans being transported to internment camps in 1942, to recognize their subject for what it was, a crime committed by the government against a large group of American citizens. Few people who saw those photographs in the 1940s could have had so unequivocal a reaction. The grounds for such a judgment were covered over by the pro-war consensus. Photographs cannot create a moral position, but they can reinforce one and can help build a nascent one. All right, what is she trying to say here? She's saying specifically this, that given a certain circumstance, all right. For instance, she makes a real big distinction between the Korean War and the Vietnam War. All right, that there were different sentiments around both. All right, and that the photographs, the photojournalists that went into North Korea and took pictures of atrocities, due to the way that we were already kind of hyped up for that war and the way that that war was sold to us, those pictures, because of the historical and sociological context of the American people, they were already, it's kind of like being sold on a candidate to the point where you don't want to hear the opposing argument. You're already kind of sold, you know? And the same thing with World War II. She wants to say that, you know, American involvement and patriotism when it came to World War II was so hyped up that the pictures of Japanese Americans in internment camps didn't have the same kind of moral oomph to them because we kind of minimized those kind of atrocities in lieu of a higher good. All right. So it's like all she's trying to say here is that given it's like photographs or documentaries or whatever kind of images are being taken with the goal of awakening either anti-war sentiment or social activism or political activism. It always depends on whether the arrow can find its target or not, whether it's a suitable target at the time. You know what I mean? It's all about context. You know, in a given kind of conflict, it's like photographs might be effective, and in other situations, maybe not, depending on the situation, right? So that's why she says photographs cannot create a moral position, but they can reinforce one and can help build a nascent one, you know? And we saw that once again. And like, I had a student in this class last year that was from Tunisia that had been in Tunisia during the Arab Spring, the big Arab uprising in the Arab nations that spread from Egypt to Libya to Algeria and some of the other places, right? And that a lot of it had been sparked by this picture of a guy who had set himself on fire, and that it was just the right. It was just there was enough there already, and there was enough bubbling under the surface in terms of sentiment, in terms of the shared feeling that they had had enough, that the picture itself was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. Does that make sense? That you need, it's like sometimes it's like you can take a picture of whatever kind of atrocity you want, but unless the people are already somewhat sympathetic and riled up over that sentiment, it may or may not be effective. Think of a recent example. All right. What's a recent example of a situation where not necessarily a photo, but a piece of video was just totally right. Was the total right arrow at the right time to flare up the right situation? What am I talking about?
George Floyd.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That there had been, there had been numerous instances over the last decade of other situations where African Americans were being brutally beaten up on camera, and they didn't. It just wasn't enough tinder for the spark, and and then and then finally you situation where the pandemic is already making people crazy, and we're already seeing, as a direct effect of the pandemic, we're already seeing the Black community get hit far harder in terms of the numbers and severity, that is already kind of foregrounding inequities and the systemic racism in the healthcare system, so that it took very little. I mean, I mean, let's give the video credit where it's due. It's highly incendiary and it's very emotive. You know, when a man is crying out for his mother, I don't think any human being, you know, except the most hardened fucking racist among us, cannot be moved to empathize with this idea, you know, of calling out for your mother, you know, when you're dying, you know, and so much and so much of the other pieces of that, I think, were enough to rally people and just really, it was just boom, you know. But it's like I said, it's like the right image for the right time and the right kind of circumstances to set off the right kind of revolt. Is, you know, once again, we can see the power of images. We can see, you know, people, you know, talk about like images, what do they mean? They're so ephemeral, who cares? And yet it's images more often than not in modernity that set off these things, you know, these you know, billions of dollars worth of damage, very, very concrete results that stem from an ephemeral image, you know, in the right place and at the right time. And that's what Sontag is saying here with that. Everything is like slow here. Like, I swear to God, it's like today, it's like I'm trying to do this in this like Grand Central Station outside. It's usually not like this. Just shut the door though. And she talks about the whole thing. Just one last thing I want to talk about in regards to this essay, an important takeaway with this essay. At the end of it, she makes this statement about the difference between she says here, photography implies that we know about the world if we accept it as the camera records it. But this is the opposite of understanding, which starts from not accepting the world as it looks. All possibility of understanding is rooted in the ability to say no. Strictly speaking, one never understands anything from a photograph. And I want to just really briefly talk about the context in which she says this, all right? She says in the article on page 3, she says, photography implies that we know about the world if we accept it as the camera records it. But this is the opposite of understanding, which starts from not accepting the world as it looks. All right? All possibility of understanding is rooted in the ability to say no. Strictly speaking, one never understands anything from a photograph. Of course, photographs fill in the blanks in our mental pictures of the present and the past. For example, Jacob Riis's images of New York squalor in the 1880s are sharply instructive to those unaware that urban poverty in the late 19th century America was really that Dickensian. Nevertheless, the camera rendering of reality must always hide more than it discloses. All right? What is she trying to say here? All right? She's trying to say something about knowledge. All right, look, it's really knowledge versus understanding. Knowledge versus understanding. All right? That understanding implies what? Something that a photo can never provide us with. Understanding provides what? There's a couple of different answers to that, but I'll just give one. Understanding implies context, right? It's like we have to understand. It's like it's not enough to see a photo of, for instance, it's not enough to see a photo of, for instance, workers in a factory, all right? It doesn't really tell us much. She uses the example of, for instance, She says, the camera's rendering of reality must always hide more than it discloses. As Brecht points out, a photograph of the NIP works or a factory reveals virtually nothing about the organization, in contrast to the amorous relation, which is based on how something looks. Understanding is based on how something functions. And functioning takes place in time and must be explained in time. Only that which narrates can make us understand. All right. So what is she trying to say here? In order for us to garner understanding of something, it usually involves being understood. For instance, I take a picture of, for instance, let's say I get a picture of some situation, some situation. Let's like take an obvious example, like the picture of Napalm Girl from the Vietnam War. All right. It's like, how much knowledge does it provide me with that picture standing alone? Unless I understand, she says that the picture alone cannot give me an understanding of all the geopolitics, all of the history involved, all the anti-communist struggles, that in order for me to understand the context of that picture, I need to understand the entire source of the entire array of forces, social, political, geopolitical, ideological forces that led to an event, the napalm spraying of this girl. It gives me an understanding. I never have understanding from just the image. I can only get understanding when I understand, when I'm given the knowledge to understand the forces involved and how that image came about. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? But a picture, it used to be like the old adage was a picture said 1,000 words. And yet, what Sontag wants to say is that without context, without historical context of knowing what led up, it's like what Berger was saying about those Hall's paintings. Remember the paintings of Hall's paintings of the Regentists, the people that were paying his bill. Remember we were having that conversation? Somebody. And what did he say at that time? Jay, you have that. What did Berger say at that time? Berger said what? It was one thing to like one critic, remember, the one that he was calling out. He was calling out that critic that was looking at those paintings just in terms of their form, their stylistic form, how they used black and whites, how they represented the human condition. And Berger said no. It's like, in order to understand those pictures, you have to understand the relationship that artist had to those people at that time, and that gives us knowledge. The pictures alone, standing on their own, we walk through in a gallery, do we understand anything about the inequities that generated those pictures and the style that they did? The differences between the haves and have-nots, the ways in which an economic system was set up that would create a situation in which a world-renowned painter, one of the greatest painters of his generation, would have to beg to stay alive and paint these people. That's all she's saying. Do we get that? So, Nathaniel, before I end this out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I properly unpacked it so that we can understand it. All right. So she does. So to round Sontag up, she says says a lot of different things. But I think that the takeaways from Sontag can be boiled down a couple of things. When it comes to photography, it is always a double-edged sword in terms of the goals. It's like the goals of using photography, the ways in which we use photography are often mundane, but at the same time, it can often be of a highly moral and ethical dimension to them. But it all depends on the context. But ultimately, I think what she's trying to say is that the medium itself, in this case, photography, but it could be as easily said about music or film or television or blogs or anything else. The medium is fairly neutral. There are certain biases to it that we can take into account, but that it's what we do with it that ultimately denote its value, and what kind of it has. There's a spectrum of I mean, there's a big difference between taking a picture, of our cat, with a Santa Claus, as opposed to some, going above and Call of Duty to get pictures of refugees coming out of Kosovo. Same mean, different modalities, right? Does that make sense? Everyone's kind of mute today. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this up on the blog for people that couldn't attend. I'm going to wrap up on next Tuesday. I'm definitely going to wrap up Bazan and Benson, and then we're going to start talking about the midterm, and we'll get those out, and you'll get the essays back. Do I have any other questions? Any other questions?
No.
All right, you guys. Let's call it a day.
Okay.
Have a good day. Take care of yourselves. Have a nice weekend.
Bye,
You too.
Professor.
Yeah.
Take care.